Hello and welcome back to How to Art. So we are about halfway through the mini-series and I am grateful to you all for sticking with me so far. So for this week's video we are looking at making a comic book script. I am going to show you how to write a script for a comic book and why you need one. But first I'm going to explain the difference between books and comic books. I feel this is a pertinent part as comic books can't display things that you see in books and vice versa. If you want to skip the history and explanation of the strengths and weaknesses of the comics, then press this button here and it will skip forward. If, however, you appreciate the history, then stay tuned. Books. Writing has been around since the Stone Age, with people making markings on cave walls and so on, but written things as we know it was probably around 7 BC, and probably even earlier. Mesopotamia, which is now the Middle East, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, that area, used to use clay tablets and carving characters into the moist clay. This was called cuneiform, and the first written complaint was a complaint written to someone called E-Nasir, where a man was complaining about the quality of copper he had received on a clay tablet. This was written around 1750 BC, so people do not change after all. A little bit later, around 4,000 years, the ancient Egyptians had papyrus, which was the marrow of a plant stem, and these were scrolls that would roll out, some as long as 40 meters, such as the history of Ramses III. He was a good pharaoh, I remember his reign. We always had bread. People found ways to write things all across the world using bone, wood, silk, and it wasn't until the 1st century AD that China made paper. However, the first printed book was not written until 868 AD, so nearly 700 years later, where they used a block of wood with characters written in reverse, and that was used to create a print on paper. Now I love books. I couldn't eat a whole one. I'm no Glob Globe Gabgalab.
I'm the Glob Globe Gabgalab. I love books, and this basement is a true treasure trove. I am the Glob Globe Gabgalab, the schwabble double wabble gabble flibber blabber blab.
That's enough of that now. Anyway, I struggle greatly with reading fiction, as my mind wanders, which is a shame as I think there is something so magnificent about them. So, books, these magnificent things that allow us to hallucinate vividly by looking at tattooed dead trees. What could possibly be a disadvantage of a book? Well, for starters, books miss out on anything visual. Watching a horror film and seeing something jump out at you, or something subtly hiding in the background, like in The Grudge, is something you completely miss in a book. That sudden burst or shock you get from jump scares you cannot get from normal books. Even in non-horror films they have their place. Take Nolan's Dark Knight for example.
Are you up to it? You better be. Because they get anything on you. And those criminals are back on the streets, followed swiftly by you and me.
They are also really slow. When you're reading an action sequence or a fight, I always imagine the other party sort of shuffling on the spot whilst the book describes the other members. However, books have some advantages that are exclusive to books. For example, in A Dance with Dragons, I believe it is, by George R.R. Martin, there is a fantastic setup of describing Reek as this pathetic husk of a man in great detail, and it is made as a dramatic reveal that it is Theon Greyjoy. This kind of slow description could only be achieved by a book, as visuals tend to explain what something is unless they disguise it or use darkening. But the level of description being in the open and not hidden in any way is something exclusive to books. Books also allow individualism. When you read a book, you get your own personal version of the book that no one can take away from you. Unless a film adaptation is made or character drawings are present, but each time you pick up a fresh book and read how the author describes an area and the characters, your imagination will be unique to you, which is something I find quite sweet. Now onto comic books. Comic books are a visual means of telling your story, and their history is very similar to normal books. Images have been used since the Stone Age, and one could argue that comic books are older than regular books. The Bayeux Tapestry, for example, is a 70-metre series of images depicting in detail what happened in the Battle of Hastings. Because of this, we know so much more about what happened, even to the details of how Harold Hardrada was killed. You may not consider this a comic book, but by definition it is. Listen to this. This is the definition. A sequence of drawings in boxes that tell a story, typically printed in a newspaper or magazine. I know, the Bayeux Tapestry wasn't featured in a magazine or newspaper, seeing as newspapers weren't actually invented until 1605, but it's still images depicting a story. The etymology is interesting as well, as it's a North American word originating from comedy, which is why a lot of the older comics told funny stories or anecdotes. However, comics as we know them now only recently came into popularity in sort of the 60s and 70s. The Golden Age, which was in the 1930s, started with Detective Comics in 1937, which is now known as DC. Now, what are the disadvantages of a comic book? Well, for one, they take a considerable amount of time to make. Each frame is a drawing in itself, and in my upcoming comic, one of my frames took me 50 hours to draw. It was a full page panel, to be fair, but still. I mean, I was fairly new to Photoshop as well, so it took me a bit longer than it would do now. But 50 hours, that's more than a week's work. You'll actually be able to see the trailer for my comic on the 28th of August as well. I'll put my Instagram in the comments below. Comics do struggle to stop people from spoiling it for themselves as well. How often have you read a comic and there's a big vibrant image on the opposite page and it draws you in, you just can't tear your eyes away, and then as soon as you look at it, ruined. You've ruined it. You've ruined the build-up. And the moment when you see your beloved character kill their best mate, this is why structuring your comic book in the script is very important. To avoid things like this, Junji Ito in Shiver had a magnificent scene that actually sent shivers down my spine, as there's a knocking on a window. And when you turn the page, you see his friend covered in holes, and it's horrible, and it's just a good example of well-planned frames. Remember the 7 Ps, people. Proper prior planning prevents ruddy poor performance. Comics are generally better at displaying action than books. Remember in my last video I mentioned the action-to-action frame? All very pertinent. One thing you need to watch out for though is not enough talking. Have you ever noticed in Marvel and DC, whenever there's a big fight, although a lot of action is occurring, the villain seems to keep talking to the hero to try and distract him. This is actually so you spend more time looking at each panel. Your peripheral vision will take in more information when you read a panel with writing than if you just have a picture. Be honest, how many of you regular comic book readers take your time with each page and appreciate the art occurring in each panel? Generally speaking, your audience will look at a regular panel for half a second before moving on to the next one. More austere readers that appreciate comics will of course spend longer at each page, as will artists, and really soak up the experience. But if you want your reader to spend more time on your panel, put writing in there, even if it is a bit waffly. I know in my first video I said only to include something if it's relevant or aids your story in any way, but this is a perfectly valid reason, as you are forcing your reader to spend longer on each panel, thus understanding the story better as they can see what is happening. Okay, so that's a little bit about books and comics, so now let's look at making a script. Here's a little story that I wrote. It's only a paragraph long, but this will be enough. You'll notice that when you read a comic, on one page not much happens, as majority of frames are action to action, aka 1 to 3 seconds. So a page in a comic will typically only last around 20 seconds in real life, which the equivalent of a book is a paragraph. So let me just read my story to you. James woke up in a sweat. He looked out the window. Nothing had changed. "Drats!" he cried, ensuring to keep his voice low in case he awoke the others. He slowly crawled out of bed and made his way downstairs until he was at the front door. "Going so soon?" James turned around and saw one of the others staring at him with a smile. "You can't leave yet. You haven't had breakfast." "It's fine, I'll pick something up on the way. I'm in a bit of a rush right now." James had to lie. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but the last few days, something had been really off about his family, as if it was something else wearing their skin, or he was hallucinating, or even they were robots in a simulation. All he knew is he had to get out of there, now. It's not the best story, I'll admit it. I sort of wrote it fairly quickly as just an example. How do we now turn this into a comic? Well, the first thing I do is I start off with breaking it down into any changes. In this example, the first thing that happens is that James, our protagonist, wakes up out of bed in a cold sweat. Then he looks out the window. Right there are 2 frames. The first of him waking up from what we assume was a nightmare, and the other is him looking out the window, a change. From that sentence alone, despite there not being much description of what is going on, you should have something pictured in your head as we speak. As it is your story, you should have a better grasp of the details than, say, your artist. Now, your script needs to be clear enough so that when your artist receives it, they are able to draw your pages as close to the concept as you want them to. This leads me on to the second rule of writing a script. Whenever there's a change, new frame. To write a description, we would do it like this. As you can see, I have a template here that I made because I am extremely kind. I start off with my title at the top, and then I do a subheading for the page. This is very important so your poor artist doesn't try and fit 27 frames onto a single piece of A4. It allows them to position the frames and panels. I will get into that next video. Once we establish the page, we now declare the frame, and we now go into detail on the frame. So we could write Frame 1. Bird's eye shot of James sitting up in bed. His hands are holding him up from behind him, and he is looking up towards the ceiling camera. He is covered in sweat. His room is typical of a teenager, with a bedside table, lamp, bookshelf situated to his right or your left, and he has a window with curtains to his left, your right. His bed sheets are crumbled and by his waist and below. This gives us a good description of what the room looks like, and if you give this to an artist, they'll be able to draw everything you have said, and now they have their scene. Because they already have this scene, you don't need to describe every frame in as much detail if it is in the same location. Now, not all frames will have talking in it. Sometimes you will have to just have a picture, and that's fine too. But when we go further, we will want more writing. Otherwise, your comic will be read in a couple of minutes. I tend to leave a line space before declaring the next frame. This just gives us some formatting to the script. Rule number 3. Give as much description of the frames to your artists. If your artist is not too sure what's going on, it won't look how you want it to. So give them as much information and description as you can. Now, in terms of speaking in each frame, this is how I do it. So first of all, I start a new paragraph. Then I will write the name of the character that's speaking. Then I'm going to press tab to indent their speech. This is good formatting practice. Then I will put in speech marks what the actual words are, like this. And then after that, after they've spoken, I will put in anything after that in that same indent of what needs to be said. So if it's not just speaking, they could be thinking or shouting. So I might say this is them thinking. So obviously they're not going to do normal speaking if they're thinking, oh, my boss is a Rudy tootin' naughty man. They're probably not going to say that out loud to their boss as opposed to thinking it. So you need to put these in there. Otherwise your artists and letterers won't know. Okay? Maintain this consistency and you will be golden. Okay, so that's your 4th rule. Maintain consistency. Remember, this is so the rest of your team are able to construct the comic to the best of their abilities, and you want them all to work together without losing anything in translation. You're probably thinking, of course, Mr. Art, I'll make a script for my comic book and characters. Wait a minute, where the hell are my character descriptions? In terms of characters, you will need to make some concept art for them. Now, with every author and writer, you have in your head what your character looks like. Now, you can draw some sketches of your character too, but if you need more help with concept art, I can make a video of that if you like. Let me know in the comments below. This video is more about a comic book script. This is about writing. Now, I'm going to leave a link with access to the template for your own scripts in the comments below. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me, mainly because I know you guys like the videos and I'm not just making them for the sake of it. I have got a small channel after all, but we all have to start somewhere. Thank you very much for watching and take care.